Hi, welcome to Train Signal. My name is Bill and this lesson is the logical architecture of SharePoint. In this lesson we are going to talk about the logical structure of SharePoint. We've already got our farm up and running, but we haven't really spent any time talking about the individual parts. So you might have some questions, you might be a little bit confused, and this lesson we're going to go and take a closer look at all of those things. We're going to look at web applications, site collections, sites, application pools. We'll talk a little bit about lists, libraries, all of those things, and it's going to make it a lot clearer to you by the time we're done. So let's go ahead and let's get started. By now you probably have a number of questions. Lots of things on your mind, aren't there? We have talked about a lot of different things. I've thrown a lot of terms at you, and some we've gone into great detail to explain, and others I've told you, you know what, just wait, we're going to get to it. Well, now we're going to go ahead and talk in greater detail about a number of these different things. So let's go ahead and let's start with our SharePoint farm. No, not that farm. I'm talking about this farm in our logical structure of SharePoint. Now remember, for this discussion, we're not talking about the physical hardware. We're not talking about our servers. We're not talking about our topology. We are talking the logical structure of SharePoint. So we start with our SharePoint farm. And our farm is where our web application lives. And remember, as we talked about, we can have multiple web applications. In fact, we can have up to 20 web applications per farm. So you're probably asking yourself now, so Bill, what exactly is a web application? Well, a web application is the highest level component in the logical architecture of SharePoint. It's our top tier. Everything else, site collections, sites, lists, libraries, all of that come underneath the web application. And we'll take a closer look at that a little bit later on. A web application is also an IIS site that will contain SharePoint site collections. And if you recall, in a previous lesson, we went ahead and we took a look at this in IIS. And we're actually going to do the same thing. I know we've already been there, but it never hurts to go back and take a second look. So hang in there with me. Web applications are not created in IIS. And again, we have talked about this before. Web applications have their own application pools. Now, don't get hung up on what an application pool is just yet. I promise by the end of this lesson that will be clear. We're going to talk about application pools in just a few minutes, but keep that in the forefront of your mind because we are also going to go ahead and take a look at those. And web applications can be restarted independently in IIS, and that's important. The role of our web application is to provide the ability to isolate content, processes, features, and users. Let me give you an example. You can have content that anonymous users can see that is different from content that authenticated users can see by hosting the same content in different web applications. Let's go ahead now and let's go back to IIS and take another look at our web applications. All right, here we are in IIS and we're on our SharePoint server and we have sites opened and we can see that we have our central administration and SharePoint 80. Now SharePoint 80 was created when we ran that farm configuration wizard for the second time, and this is where we created the site collection for our GlobalMantics main site, if you recall that from a previous lesson. And these are IIS sites or web applications. Now we didn't have to come in here and create these. We didn't go to IIS to create these sites. They were created for us by SharePoint just by doing the install and running those wizards. Now let's go ahead and let's take a look at application pools. And we see also an application pool for our SharePoint 80 and for our central administration. So each one of those web applications has their own application pool. And like I said, we're going to talk more about application pools in a little bit, but you can start to see how you can separate these things depending on how you need them. So you can start to isolate, like we talked about, users, processes, content. All right, let's go ahead and let's go back to our slides. All right, we're back at our farm. We have our web applications, and our web applications contain our site collections. And each web application can have one site collection or multiple site collections. In fact, you can have a staggering 750,000 site collections per farm. That's a lot of site collections. And of course, all of this is dependent on your hardware. I mean, you have to be able to have the resources to support that much data, but this is what's officially supported by Microsoft. So you're asking yourself now, what exactly is a site collection? Site collection, as the name implies, is a collection of sites. Remember that SharePoint is a web-based platform comprised of many sites. And whether you're using SharePoint simply for your organizational intranet, or you're using it for your forward-facing website for all the world to see, or maybe both, SharePoint site collections can help you organize those sites into logical groups. All right, so we're back on our farm. We have our web application, our top tier. We have our site collections. And of course, our site collections have sites. And you can have one, or you can have multiple sites on each site collection. So you can start to see now how all of these work together and build one on top of each other. Now in our SharePoint environment, as we saw, we can have multiple site collections. And they can be as big or small as they need to be. Now often I'm asked, why do I need multiple site collections? I mean, I can create subsites on each one of these site collections. So why do I need site collections? Well, there's a lot of reasons for this, and the reasons are many and varied, but a very common reason is to create a site collection for each individual team or organizational unit. So we have sales, marketing, and production here in our example. So each department has their own site collection, each with its own administrator, its own permissions, its own user groups and services and features. Now in large organizations, you might have dozens, hundreds, even thousands of SharePoint sites. And as the company grows, of course, the SharePoint's going to grow as well. And from an administrative standpoint, creating new site collections is easier to manage than continually adding more subsites, which, eventually is going to make your site cumbersome and hard to administer. It's much easier to assign a site collection admin to each of these collections rather than have one admin try to manage every aspect of every site. And as I said, our site collections can have multiple subsites. In fact, you can have 250,000 websites per site collection. Again, allowing for the proper hardware and resources to support all of that, but that's a lot of websites. All right, let's go ahead now and let's take another look at our farm. We have our web application, our site collection, our sites, and now we can also add in our application pools. And as we can see here, and we've looked at this, we've seen the application pools in IIS. Now you can have multiple web applications assigned to an application pool, or you can simply have one application pool for each web application. In fact, you can have 10 application pools per web server. Now, here's the big question, right? So what exactly is an application pool? Application pools are separate sets of IIS worker processes that share the same configuration and application boundaries. They're used to isolate web applications for better security, reliability, availability, and performance. Each can run without impacting one another. And web applications can also share application pools. Let's imagine that we have a web application that's hosting our forward-facing internet site. Now obviously this has different security concerns, different sets of users and permissions, and you want it to have good performance. You don't want what's going on that to impact the rest of your web applications, which perhaps it's your local enterprise intranet, whatever it is. You can use an application pool to isolate that web application. Now, if you're still not clear as to what the application pools are and how we use them and how they work, when we go ahead and create web applications and create or assign application pools to them, it'll all become much clearer because you'll actually be able to physically see what's going on and how we're assigning these application pools, all right? So hang in there with me. That's coming up in a future lesson. But let's go ahead and let's continue on talking about our logical structure. Back to our farm, and once more we see web applications, site collections, sites, and application pools. And now we're going to add content databases. And each web application can have one or multiple content databases, and your site collections, and consequently all of the sites and libraries and lists that are part of those site collections, all of that content will be hosted on those content databases. And we can have up to 500 content databases per farm. And so the next logical question, of course, is what is a content database? Well, content database, and it should be pretty obvious, it's our SQL Server databases, and they host all of our content. And like we said, we can associate one or more content databases with a web application. So all of our content, all of our SharePoint pictures, libraries, items, lists, everything lives in those content databases. So again, you can really see the value now of that web application. It really is the top level of all that SharePoint is. Now let's go ahead and zoom in a little bit closer on site collections and see everything that they provide. All right, so we start at the top, of course, with our web application, and then we have our site collection, or as we've seen, multiple site collections. And each site collection has a top-level site. You have to have this. Every site collection has to have that one top-level site. You can't have a site collection without a site, and the reverse is true as well. You can't have a site that isn't part of a site collection. Now, those top-level sites can have multiple sites below them, as we've seen. And you don't have to have a site below that top-level site. That's up to you. Depends on what you need. But those sites, whether it's top-level site, your sub-sites, can have lists and libraries, lists of items, things like a task list, or a library full of documents or photos or presentations, whatever it is. And those lists and libraries can also be organized using folders. And all of this is going to become apparent, be much more clear as we go through the rest of the course and we start working with all of these individual things. We actually start creating web applications, we start creating site collections, we create sites. We'll even take a look at creating lists and libraries and start working with those things. So for now, that's all for this lesson. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.